thank you so much for coming tonight for the launch of the 5th edition of foundational, influential text culture industries. This is my copy here. If this was I was going to say, if this was an American audience, you'd be like rapturous applause. But we're in the British Academy after all.
That's pretty rapturous for the British Academy, I believe.
So yeah, it's so wonderful to see you and to celebrate Dave, especially, as well as his book. It's a real pleasure for me to be here personally. I'm going to just take the moment to be a little bit indulgent. But Dave's a dear colleague and mentor and mate. I think we're mates. Yeah. And
after tonight, maybe not.
So in the preface of the 5th edition, Dave mentions how the ideas for the book, you were starting developing the ideas for the book on a course, which Christine Geraghty is here somewhere, who was head of department at Goldsmiths at the time. And that course was called Contemporary Issues in the cultural industries.
I'd never even heard of the cultural industries before until Christine ordered me to teach a course in it.
And that was
it's not quite true.
And that was 1998?
96.
96. Yeah. I think I was like in the second cohort as a student at Goldsmiths. So that was the first time I was taught by Dave. And a little bit cheesy, but it literally changed my life. I think doing that course made me realise that I could study the stuff I was passionate about and cared about, and didn't realise that you could teach or learn at uni. I mean, that's media studies for you. But also, it's the reason why I'm here today. So I've embarrassed you enough before. So thank you very much, Dave.
Thank
you. Enough of that. This is about Dave and the 5th edition of the cultural industries. Right, so what's going to happen is we're going to talk for between ourselves. You can listen if you like for the next 40 minutes. 40 minutes, and then there'll be questions. So please do. We'd love to. So many people who you know and love and have worked with and had families with as well. So we want to hear from you guys. So do note down questions in your head, and there'll be time we'll try and get as many questions as possible. But let me just very quickly introduce this book. So this is the 5th edition of the cultural industries. As I said, it has become even from that get-go, it was a foundational text in our field and one of the most influential texts in our field. In the book, for those of you who know it, a big framing device is change and continuity. And we're going to talk a bit more about that in the conversation. But I'm going to tell you about change and continuity across the 5 editions of the culture industries. The first thing to say, I got my first edition of the culture industries from my bookshelf the other day. And the first thing to say in terms of change is look how much bigger the new edition is. This is like a little baby in comparison. They're bigger fun. It's massive. It's massive. And the topic is getting the attention it deserves, quite frankly. Dave has expanded it. It is, for those of you who work in our field and do research and teach in our field, the stuff that you're thinking about over the last few months, Dave's written about it in here, already. All your money back. And it's incredible for that, the way in which Dave has kept on top of all the latest issues relating to cultural industries research, but cultural industries generally. And also, I think, and that means that there's a greater focus on the digital and what you very simply, but really, I think just really effectively call digital cultural platforms. The impact of those things on media industries has radically transformed how culture is made and is consumed. Not too radically. Again, we're going to come back to this. So greatly expanded, up to a minute. But also, in terms of continuity, a lot of the things have stayed the same. So you're going to get that clarity and precision. That is absolutely, I think, a hallmark of your work, Dave, if you don't mind me saying. It's like the breadth, like you've read everything. I mean, it's incredible. Like the amount of reading that has gone into this book and the generosity that you give to people who feature in it, even when you're slagging them off, is really, like, I think, again, a real quality of Dave's work beyond cultural industries. And also as well, I think, is the way in which Dave writes in this really accessible manner without it being dumbed down, you know, in a way that, and I don't know another academic writer, and this, and I hope I cause no offense in this room, but who manages to write in a way that is both like equally accessible to students and academic colleagues, right? You know, like, and it's pitched at them equally.
I can see at least 3.
Okay, I'll take your word for it. And I'm not just talking like university students. I'm talking high school students. So I don't know if you know this, and so this is why I embarrassed Dave a little bit. I see my mate Claire's over there who puts me and Dave on at the BFI. So for those of you who don't know, Cultural Industries as well features on the A-level curriculum for media studies. There's excerpts from it, right? And so Claire from Media Magazine invites Dave and I to do kind of this, actually. We're going to take this on the road after this, I think, and when Dave gets a word in. And it is in that, so we're doing this talk to about 400 media studies students, and it's about Dave's book, and Claire says to me, can you just ask, you know, they study this, can you just maybe form some questions that makes it relatable to them? I'm like, yeah, okay. So, you know, they read it. They're probably a little bit bored of it. Let's try and make it exciting. I couldn't have got it more wrong. Have you seen the clips of when the Beatles land in America? I was like, what is happening? Like everyone on the edge of it, David Hesmondhalgh is like, the gasps when they hear his name pronounced correctly. Oh, it's Hesmondhalgh. It was, and then the cues afterwards, the selfies, the signings, it was like all around the BFI. It was absolutely insane. And that is the impact that Dave has had. So anyway, that's just, I just wanted to embarrass you for a minute there. If I can ask you some questions now, where maybe we can learn a bit more about the book and stuff.
Sure.
So,
shall I read?
Yeah, that's it. That's what we planned. So Dave, as a nuisance served wine before the event, Dave. Dave's going to actually read a bit from the preface, which will give you a taste of what the new edition's about. Thanks, Dave.
Thank you, Anamik. That's so kind and so lovely. So just to give you a flavour of the 5th edition, I guess, and where it stands in relation to the earlier stuff. As I complete another substantial revision and updating of this book in 2025, hybrids of authoritarianism, anti-migrant racism, and post-neoliberal anti-government economics have been achieving even greater electoral success. On the left and in the centre of the ideological spectrum, political and cultural pessimism prevail and despair is on the rise. The internet, web and social media now play important, if often banal, roles in the lives of billions of people, and this continues to have significant implications for the cultural industries and therefore for people's cultural experiences. As with the 4th edition, part 4 of this book examines those implications in detail, and parts 2 and 3 provide an updated account of how the cultural industries and their crucial frenemies, the IT industries, came to be the way they are. That account still emphasises the vital importance of the 1980s and 1990s in laying the ground for what followed, an importance that is in danger of being forgotten as those eras recede into the distant past. Even though the cultural industries and the digital networks that increasingly shape them have continued to mutate, the period since I wrote the 4th edition in 2017 and 2018 has seen a more stable picture of the cultural industries emerge after the chaos of the century's first decade. The current state of cultural production centres on digital platforms operated by vast, powerful tech corporations that are largely unaccountable to democratic control and indifferent to the public interest and the common good. They offer abundance and convenience, but understand people as users and consumers rather than as citizens. That abundance is still mainly supplied by the corporate inheritors of the conglomeration and vertical integration that took place towards the end of the last century. But it's now supplemented by the work of millions of others, self-releasing musicians, self-publishing authors, YouTube creators, TikTok influencers, and so on a spectrum from amateur to professional, much of whose work is barely noticed. Futuristic conjecture has now shifted to the effects of still emergent AI technologies, discussed in this edition, and currently the subject of hundreds of academic dissertations and journal articles, and endless media coverage, much of it still highly speculative. We'll skip a bit. Although this book draws attention to many unfortunate developments in cultural production and distribution, I'm not a pessimist. People who want to change the world for the better often focus on problems, and if they offer solutions at all, they're frequently rather utopian. I too want to see radical change, but I think pessimism isn't an effective way to achieve it. The world is always likely to give us many reasons to think that things are bad. Stupidity, ignorance, corruption, cruelty, and self-interest often prosper. And we only have to look at some of the people running our nations and businesses to know it. The cultural industries reflect that fact, and because of their distinctive power, they can often make the situation worse. But the world also shows abundant evidence of intelligence, knowledge, integrity, kindness, and altruism. Wonderful things get done, made, written, and played by people every day. Some of this happens via the cultural industries. This isn't just because some good stuff manages to survive a broken system, though the system undoubtedly has serious problems, as I show in this book. It's also because there are people in the cultural industries who actively make good things happen. Those good things include products that enhance our understanding, knowledge, imagination, and pleasure by making us laugh or think hard, and sometimes by shocking, challenging, or disturbing us. For me, those things are why culture is important and why the cultural industries continue to matter.
I think one of the things that's always drawn me to this book is that it's always had that strong social justice orientation. And I think that's why so many students actually really grab onto it really early at the beginning. Quite unusual for what we might call a textbook as well, I think. Can you talk about maybe when you're going back to that first iteration? Let's have a look at the cover again. Look how urban Dave was back then. What kind of what was the impulse for writing it? What problems were you trying to solve? At what point? Can you give us some examples of times where you felt the way in which the cultural industries were making culture in a way that both disturbed you but also got you excited?
I think punk was a very important thing for me. It changed my life, my way of thinking in the 1970s. And it made me interested in the politics of cultural production. And I somehow ended up doing a PhD at Goldsmiths on the history of independent record companies, and came across, as a PhD student, I was reading various kinds of theory for the first time, and as you do, finding things not quite matching your experience of the world, your understanding of the world. And at the time, it's kind of mid-1990s when Christine instructed me to do that course we mentioned earlier. it was it was when neoliberalism had really just landed, and it was being accepted all over the world by governments and policymakers as the only way. And cultural production had got bound up in that because there was this idea of the creative industries, which were, and there are people in the room whose eyes I'm catching who were writing a lot at the time about this. There was this idea that the creative industries would be a means for prosperity and employment in post-industrial Western economies. And New Labour, most famously, promoted that idea. So that was happening in the political centre, really. But I was also disaffected by a tendency on the left, which is, where I have belonged in a sense since I was a teenager, of a pervasive pessimism that industrialised culture was just a monstrous system for maintaining conformity, an ideological powerhouse, and culture just seemed, commercial culture, popular culture, seems so much more interesting and complex than that. Music has been very central to the way I think about these things, as I know it has for you, Anamik. And I was playing Gil Scott Heron before to try and make this a less posh venue. It just seemed like there's plenty of stuff out there that is challenging, adventurous, that is part of the cultural industries, as in the extract I was just reading. So I was pushing back against the conservatism and complacency of the centre and the right, and an excessive pessimism and some simplifications on the left, I guess.
We've talked about this a lot, me and you, but so this is fundamental to the book, the way in which you navigate between that kind of slight pessimism, like a strong pessimism that is, characteristic of certain parts of the left versus a liberal market celebration, right, and optimism. Digital utopianism is a real bugbear for you. But when you kind of navigate that, we get to those three words: complexity, contestation, contradiction. Do you feel like that can sometimes blunt our political impetus, if you like, what we're trying to challenge, by stressing things as, well, it's a bit complicated. I know that's not what you do. It's a bit complicated. But nonetheless, the emphasis on complexity, where does that leave us politically?
Yeah. There's I often quote this, including to PhD students. Some of them are in the room. But there's a book by the doyen of American journalism studies, Michael Schudson, where he talks about a comment that a colleague once made to him. And this guy said to him, Michael, the problem with your books is that they all have the same message, which is that things are a bit more complicated than you thought they were. And when I read that, I was like horrified. I was like, oh my God, I think that's me. But there are kind of worse things, aren't there, than to try and overcome simplifications. But you're right, the danger is that you lose the political thrust. And, there are colleagues who I really respect and revere, actually, for their ability to write from a place of fury, really, of righteous fury. And that's just not who I am. I think I want to stress that positivity, to keep that in sight. And of course, people have to judge whether it fails to achieve the emancipatory aims that I always want to pursue.
One of the things, I just mentioned it, but digital optimism. So in terms of thinking about changes across the editions, back in 2002 when the first edition came out, I don't think you could have even imagined, some of the stuff we're seeing right now, whether that's, but not least the way in which big tech is playing such a huge role in culture making now. And again, I really like, it was so simple, but digital cultural platforms is, something I think really just helps us understand a massive segment of the political economy of media right now. We've seen ongoing claims about, how digital transformations radically transformed the cultural industries. How do you think about, go back to this notion of change and continuity, how do you think about that in relation to technology?
Well, not just technology, but to economics and politics and culture itself, I guess. Yeah, those claims that something is happening that's usually technological, that is going to transform everything we know about cultural production, cultural consumption, the way cultural goods are distributed. I mean, never a year goes by without there being some hype about that. Of course, at the moment, it's generative AI that's dominating that discourse. But, one day I'll try and do a kind of timeline, for each year from, 95 to whatever now, the hype of that year about what was going to bring about transformation. And for me, the peak year of, excuse my French, bullshit about that stuff, the pinnacle of the kind of mood of digital optimism was 2006. So it was between the first and second editions, which were 2002, 2007. So I was particularly furious in the second and third editions about this pervasive, often genuinely idiotic digital optimism that saw the products of Silicon Valley essentially as a means to human emancipation. I mean, just extraordinary for those younger people who weren't around at the time. You might be skeptical. Did people really think and say that? Yes, they did. It was extraordinary, wasn't it? And so what I tried to do in the first edition, because the internet had already made those excessively optimistic claims pervasive in the 90s. What I wanted to do was try and find a foundation of features of the cultural industries that were resilient, that lasted, that began really in the early 20th century. The 1920s is when the industrialization of culture really begins in earnest, I think. And to try and identify these features that persist. And a really important source for that was the work of political economists of culture of a particular kind. A guy called Nicholas Garnham, who's long retired. He was at Polytechnic of Central London and Westminster, and a French writer called Bernard Miege from Grenoble. And what they did was present an analysis that showed that the cultural industries are different from other industries, different industrial sectors, in a particular set of ways. That it's hard to make profit in the cultural industries because of certain features. And that would include that it's really a high risk area for investment because people can't predict what's going to work, what's going to be successful, because you don't you don't see a film until you've seen it. You don't consume a film until it's over. So people don't know what they're getting. So that leads to this kind of uncertainty about the experience. And there's also these dynamics that the cost of producing copies is tiny compared with the cost of producing the original. And that leads to extraordinary levels of profit being possible when you have a hit. So there's a massive emphasis on hits in the cultural industries, more than other industries. Other industries have some of these dynamics, of course. And then there's a set of ways in which the cultural industries try to deal with those problems. They throw mud at the wall was a phrase that's commonly used. They put out 100 products in the hope that 10 will become hits, and so on and so on. So that's a really important part of the book. And that's the way in which I try to assess how much change there's been, right? Looking at the resilience of those things. Another really important one is the tension between creativity and commerce, that people who make art want to make art They want to make a living out of it, but they want to make art because they are artists, and there are certain rewards and satisfactions that come from doing what you know how to do well. And people who want to make money often want to move that impulse in a different direction. So there's a constant struggle, a battle, a contestation between the symbol makers, the people who make the culture, and the managers and owners of the companies. The managers kind of mediating between. All these things have lasted, all these things have continued, and all these digital utopians were saying it's going to change, but we're missing these continuities. So that's a long rambling answer, but that's really what the structure of the book is, I guess.
And I understand the urge to kind of emphasize these continuities, which still structure in really profound ways how there is made. But if I could just ask, surely there's something that has happened since the first edition where there has been a shift in how culture has been made or consumed in a way that doesn't fit those continuities.
Yeah, that's right. Absolutely, it would be crazy to think that there hasn't been significant change. And for me, I guess if you put the 20th century crudely next to the 21st century, in the 20th century, the industry, the neighbouring industrial sector that was really shaping what happened in culture was the consumer electronics industry. So it was companies like Philips, like Sony, who were making the often domestic objects that we accessed our culture through. Television sets, record players, hi-fis, and so on. And they often owned the cultural industries themselves, the companies that were making and distributing the culture. And in the 21st century, it's information technology companies. And for me, that's fundamental, because the information technology companies bring with them certain ideologies, certain ways of thinking about the world, and therefore about culture. And as you will have gathered from the extract I read out, I think there are reasons to be really concerned about the power of those information technology companies. And again, looking around the room, I can see people who've written extraordinarily important work about that. So the power of IT, and within that, it was the emergence of the platform. I won't get into the weeds of explaining what that is. This isn't a classroom, but there's quite a few discussion of definitions in there. But if you take something like Netflix or Spotify as key examples of the platform, it displaces the kind of, there was something in the early web that represented a kind of chaotic openness that did provide some kind of reason for some of the optimism and even utopianism. I can see why there might have been some belief that there was a transformative thing going on there in a potentially positive way. But I think by the time that social media, originally called social networks, had formed fully, which I would put around 2010, 11, Facebook and Twitter at that time, it was becoming really apparent that there was something dark and dangerous about the role of IT in our lives. And just to say one final thing on that the implications for the very flawed, but also potentially promising form of public service media, represented in Britain, of course, most by the BBC, but also Channel 4, the implications for public service of the running amok of information technology companies across the world is a real problem. I absolutely recognise the limitations of, say, BBC News, but if you look, for example, at BBC Music Radio, which I used to hate, I used to hate Radio 1 when I was a punk. But if you look at the achievement over 60, 70 years of BBC Music Radio, for me, a lot of the criticisms of Spotify, etc., are very simplistic, but the implications of a loss of music radio as a way of enabling discovery and diversity of music is extremely worrying.
Do you listen to NTS? I turned you.
Do I listen to what?
NTS Radio.
NTS? No.
You should listen to it.
I will do.
Sorry, something I raised with Dave a few months ago.
Did you? I'm sorry.
But the other thing that's
I was reading these books for it.
The other thing that's really, really important to this book, which I think actually gets maybe under acknowledged, is the emphasis on history, like the historical approach you adopt. And that isn't just, even though you do this, like present a history of the culture industries and the development of, but it feels really radical in terms of like the kind of media and cultural industry stuff I read now. I feel like that historical account is missing often. Can you talk a bit about why, and it's not just a plotted history, is it? But there's something about your historical approach, and if you don't mind me bringing up the C word, you don't talk about conjuncture ever. It's not a conjunctural amount. Not that. That's not the, you don't define your approach in that way, but I always thought, is this just conjuncture analysis you're doing? Or?
Right, yeah. So I guess, the first edition was looking at the 70s to 2000, which is really when I wrote the book, 2000, 2001. But it was reaching back to the 20s. And for me, it was a writer called Raymond Williams that many people in the room will be familiar with, who was really important in bringing that historical approach to bear, particularly in his book called Culture. And, I must mention a really important person in my academic life and intellectual development, Georgina Bowen, Georgie, who's in Australia at the moment and couldn't be here, but Georgie introduced me to that book and to many other sources that have been really useful to me. And by the way, was advocating the close study of cultural production at a time when it was deeply unfashionable. It was really unfashionable in the 1990s to look at cultural production. Everybody was doing audiences and consumption. And Georgie was like, this has gone too far. We've got to go back to some of the production stuff. And there was this entire world of anthropology. She's an anthropologist by training, is Georgie, and sociology of culture that she drew my attention to. And a lot of that stuff is historical. I don't really identify as a Marxist, but I'm strongly influenced by a lot of Marxist thought. And it just comes with the territory if you're a Marxist. If you're a socialist, you're always trying to, if you're a feminist, you're always trying to think historically, aren't you? So it just seemed to me natural. The problem is there's just such a lot of history, and that's why it's such a ridiculously long book now.
I'm just wary of time, so I'm going to ask a question just on my own, based on my own agenda, if that's all right. One of the things that has changed a lot, I think, since the first edition, is how central questions of race, gender, sexuality, and so on have become in cultural industries research. There's little bits of it in the first edition. You definitely nod to it, and I, for those of you who don't know, but my work is basically a cultural industries approach to studying race and cultural production. And Dave's PhD, actually, one of the independent labels he looked at was this famous label called Nation Records, run by a Pakistani Bradford guy called Aki Nawaz. So actually, when I was trying to find anyone who's done any work on race specifically, in terms of cultural industries, I turned to your work. But I also critique your book in my book, saying, well, there's so much more to be said here, but it's not in Dave's book even. But that has changed. Do you want to talk a bit about the way in which those issues have kind of risen up the agenda in terms of, and I think as well, in a negative way, I think shaped by a kind of creative industries discourse as well, where diversity, which is something I'm kind of ambivalent about, let's just say, has become, the dominant paradigm, I think, in culture, or at least until very recently. So could you talk a bit more about how those race, gender, sexuality kind of figured in culture industries research?
The there's no doubt about it, there wasn't enough attention being paid to race in particular. I think, there was important feminist work being done, maybe a bit under-recognised, and, people like Angela McRobbie, I don't know if Angela's here, I don't think she is, but Angela was beginning to turn to looking at the questions of creativity around the time I was writing this book, in the late 1990s. And all kinds of people, I won't try to mention them, but it was underdeveloped, and one of the healthiest and most exciting things about studies of cultural production, research on cultural production, has been the influx of feminist women who've done some of the key work. I mean, the recent work on influences, for example, by people like our colleague Sophie Bishop, Brooke Duffy in the United States, has been so important, and it brings with it that kind of understanding of the complexity. That there's it's not a dismissal of that influencer culture, and so that's been totally healthy. And I'm not. I don't want to embarrass you by returning some of the lovely praise that you've bestowed on me, but your work has been incredibly important for me and for many other people, and to see the transatlantic alliances building up with researchers who are bringing race to bear and questions of racism to bear on cultural production has been extremely exciting for me. But of course it was long overdue. I mean, some of it was about the unbelievable whiteness of academia. I mean, 92 was when I started my PhD, and you looked at academic departments around the country, and I mean, they're absolutely homogenous, and that's begun to change again, very belatedly, but something is happening, isn't it? Yeah.
Absolutely. I'm just not wary of time. I've got another question on AI here, but maybe one of you guys could ask it, because I want to hear from you. We want to hear from you. So we've got about 20 minutes left. There's some roving mics. I think we've got someone who's going to be... They're at the back, I think, on the back shelf.
Yeah.
But does anyone have a question for Dave? We've got one person there. I just want to...
Or for Anamik.
No, it's not that. Okay, so we got this person at the front here with the
Hi, David. Thank you so much. My name is Cassie. I'm an MBA student at Central St. Martin's, and I'm from the United States. I'm from Colorado, and I'm studying the impact on the independent music industries post-COVID and the kind of transatlantic cross-capital that our two countries can maintain through a very tense political situation. As of a week ago, I've been rejected from the Fulbright Scholar Committee because I wanted to speak on working with the United Kingdom on inclusion and sharing best practices and all of these things, which is heartbreaking because I truly believe that our two music industries independently do beautiful things for independent artists. Do you have any insight on how we can maintain a cultural conversation between our two countries at a time where a lot of people who work in creative industries in the US may not agree with what's happening, but we feel a little bit like afraid to bring ourselves to the forefront in a way that's like, how do we solve this problem culturally together? Because the arts and the culture in our country are completely shut down. We have nowhere to go. I'm over here for a reason because of what's happening, and all the funding for my research has been canceled and all of that. So my goal is to bring things back to the US in a way that we can make a change and bring back that independent spirit of music and collaboration from two of the biggest music markets in the world. Do you have any insight on kind of like how to navigate that and what you see maybe happening in the future in the independent art sector, not necessarily music, but just in between making lots of money and making no money is where I study.
I wish I did. I'm sorry, I can't really offer any great wisdom here. I'd love to talk to you after about the work you're doing, and maybe that would be a better forum for me to to make suggestions, but I think the mention of independence and always tied to the notion of the alternative is something really important to me. I think I mentioned earlier that my PhD all those years ago was on the history of independent record companies in Britain. And it's a kind of compromised history because a lot of small record companies, independent companies in all sectors, have actually been very exploitative. I know there are people in this room who've been exploited by small cultural companies, but they're also a site of hope. I suspect that the vast majority of people in this room are, feeling solidarity with you and your fellow Americans as they deal, especially, in all kinds of dimensions, but including culture, as you're implying, and the richness of American alternative music culture became apparent to me when I did my master's at Northwestern, which is, as you know, in just outside Chicago, and worked on the college radio station there, and became fascinated by that kind of diversity of scenes. And it's been American independent music has been such an important source of cultural inspiration for so many Brits. I can't imagine those transatlantic routes of communication being closed down, even in an era of quasi-fascism.
Thank you.
We had a question at the back there.
Hi, Dave. First of all, congratulations, and thanks, Anamik, for such an enlivening and engaging introduction. Dave, I've been thinking in the build-up to tonight about some of the conversations that we started like 40 years ago, when we were talking about, you were at Oxford, and we're talking about canonical literature and waging war on the canon and high culture, and we were there to kind of take that down. And at the time, there wasn't that. Obviously there was the Birmingham Centre, there was the Music Press, but it felt, maybe I'm romanticising this, but it felt genuinely iconoclastic and scandalous to be talking about popular culture as being a kind of rival to that kind of canonical stuff. My question is, do you still feel that kind of, do you still get the thrills of being marginalised and the kind of, that frisson of iconoclasm? Or do you think, alas, the battle's been won?
They asked in the British Academy.
Yeah. Just to make clear, I see this as the lunatics taking over the asylum. Yeah. This is my very, very dear friend and one of my oldest friends, Graham Caveney. And conversations with Graham have been absolutely essential to this and everything else I've written. Many of them in pubs in Accrington. A very good place to discuss the politics of popular culture, believe me, because you see some of the degradations and humiliations of working class life, but you also see exciting engagements and acts of imagination and poetry. That moment that there are people in this room who were foundational to it, Christine's work on Coronation Street, back in early 81, I think it is, isn't it, Christine? And really, really important and groundbreaking, the work of the Birmingham Cultural Study. And then somehow by around 2005, or something like that, it was almost accepted that you had to take popular culture seriously. But I think it still gets simplified and distorted. And I think we've seen a return of a simplifying left pessimism around platforms, actually. and around social media. And so I still now often hear, trying to keep this compressed, I was at a symposium in Paris this week, which makes it sound very fancy. You know, it's just like a rubbish suburb of Paris. It wasn't fancy. It was very nice, and it was really great to be in a room with 12 people talking about ideas. But they were quite high culture people, so we were talking about music and its relationship to love and sex, and we were talking about Proust for an hour. But there were things that were being said in the room that still were absolutely imbued with the notion that what really matters is high culture. And believe me, I love that work that takes risks and achieves great complexity. Some of that canon is very dear to me. The same is true of if you like, the art music canon. I absolutely don't want to dismiss that. But those attitudes still persist, actually. I think they're much less hegemonic than they were. And using the word hegemonic reminds me that I didn't answer your question about conjuncture, but yeah. But thanks, Graham. Yeah, that's my go at it. Those simplifications of popular culture have come back in new forms. They haven't gone away, and I still get the frisson.
Right over here. There was someone
Hello.
back, but let's hear Zoe first.
Hi, Zoe.
Hello. Hi, Dave. Thank you so much. This was really lovely. And just generally, thank you. I'm sure I speak for many people when I say this was kind of my PhD Bible. So thank you for writing it. I have lots of questions I could ask. Please tell me about generative AI if you want to, and maybe influencers if you want to, that's fine. But I have a specific question. I actually have a question which is about, it kind of ties actually to both these questions, which is about power and being the person who kind of has written the book that is the go-to for a lot of people in the cultural industries, so or studying the cultural industries. So I'm kind of interested to know, what didn't you include? How do you decide what to include and what not to include? And how does power play a role in that when you think about giving a voice to people or not? You kind of have this position of power now because you write this book and people read it and it's on its 5th edition and it's wonderful. But I'm sure there's a lot of things that you can't include, even though you have an incredible breadth of things that you always do include in this book. So I'd just be really interested to know about your process.
Yeah, thanks, Zoe. Yeah. I find it agonising, to be honest, and it gets more agonising with each one because I feel very conscious of the fact that I've achieved this extraordinary privilege of people, reading the book, and there's these bibliographic essays at the end of each chapter that I'm told that people use as a basis for recommendations, and I neurotically go over them and have I forgotten anybody? And I've got to admit, I favour people that I feel are important new voices, and they're often people I've made a personal connection with, and I really do feel terribly anxious about omitting people and traditions, and occasionally people point out to me that there are. I've never got a massive pushback actually, but that there might be more emphasis on something. I hope it doesn't sound like false modesty to say I'm not sure it's quite the influence. The influence hasn't been quite as pervasive as Anamik's been kindly implying. I mean, put it this way, there are times when I read work that is roughly in the same area and think, oh, well, I disagree with you. And if you just read a bit of my book, you might have got it better. And that happens quite a lot. So we know that hegemony is, it's always contested and limited.
Can I mention the appendix, Dave, where you take down the haters?
Don't take them there.
Well,
It's a
how would you put it?
the main people I criticise in the appendix are friends of mine. No, and they've been very nice about that, and they've written an argument back. Can I say something about the idea of the conjuncture? So, and I think it's really important to mention Stuart Hall, and he's the writer with whom that concept is most closely associated. He gets it really from Gramsci, doesn't he? From Gramsci's stuff on the historical block and so on. So it's the idea that there is, in order to understand hegemony, the way in which the powerful win consent for their power within particular periods, there's a certain coming together of political and cultural forces. And, I think of Stuart Hall's work on that as being most fully formed in his work on Thatcherism, which we've been reading recently, haven't we, in Anamik's brilliant race and media reading group at Leeds. And I'd like to think my approach is consistent with that. It's not so much about hegemony, though. It's not so much about the winning of consent, which I take the conjuncture idea to be centred on. It's more about, it's about industry, it's about cultures of production, and it's about bringing together many different forces to understand that. So, yeah.
And you're challenging determinism, whether it's economic, technology.
Reducing explanations of what happens to technological developments or economic developments, which Marxists are sometimes accused of doing, or cultural developments. There's a certain way in which that's done. All those things need to be brought together. And that is why it was a hard book to write, and why it's a bit of a monster now, because to bring all those things together is hard. And I will not do it again.
You said that after the 4th edition. Bullshit.
I know, I did. But no, really, it is. Zoe's question brought it back to me. And so at least I'm going to abnegate any power I have accumulated now.
We're at that time of the night where I'm going to take multiple questions at once, all right? Just to save time. So we've got Sylvia there. And then, well, sorry. Actually, you were first. I'm sorry. Well, let's just take 3. Take 3 now. So Sylvia, you're right there. And then we'll have you. And then,
Joe, Sylvia, Jess.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Yeah. Go on, Joe.
Oh, well, it's Sylvia first and then Joe. All right.
Features of our times, whether you might like to comment on the prospect of the President of the United States shaping up to sue the outgoing Director General of the BBC.
Okay, let's just wait. Let's take 3 and
Okay.
then you can. So, is it Joe at the front?
Yes, Joe.
Joanna.
Yes.
Sorry, Joe.
That's all right.
You were Joe when I taught you in Accrington in 1987.
I was, yes. And I'd also like to pay tribute to Dave because he's such a wonderful teacher. And as a difficult, sullen, confused and naive teenager, you really did make a massive difference to my life. And I can remember the classes that you taught me, even though I can't remember anything I learned at 10 years in university. But anyway, putting that to one side, I wonder if you could say something about the cultural gap between, for example, a geographical gap between London and, let's say, the north, because it seems to me that it's all very well to feel positive about digital cultural industries, but there's a real avant-garde offline movement which is easily accessible in London. For example, I was at Wilton's Music Hall last night, and that's a local institution which has community support. It was created and it's maintained by a community fandom, and it has unusual and different cultural products presented. And I just wonder whether communities that are outside London who don't have access to those kinds of groups which have the educational and financial resources to create and maintain an institution like Wilton's, if they're more vulnerable to digital control by the kind of management structures that you mentioned earlier. So yeah, I'm quite interested in that geographical gap.
Thank you.
Nice one. And one more question from Jason, which is going to be the last one.
Yeah, Dave, thanks so much for that. And, eloquently optimistic as ever, and but credibly optimistic. And I think that's really important. But it strikes me that, and of course, you've never been a raver about cultural industries, even though if you are a raver on the field or in the dance hall. But I do think, or at least I wonder, contradictions. You and me both got into Ghana and Liège. I remember those conversations, and it was fantastically liberating. It was a way of opening up what appeared to be a monolith, making cultural industries appear in their rich complexity and their facility to be simultaneously capitalist agents of domination, and at the same time institutions in and through which creativity emerged. And I still hold on to that, just as you do. But it strikes me that there's another way of looking at this, and I wonder whether you share that. You repudiated anger at the beginning, and I want to stand up for anger for a minute. I want to ask you: do you not think that we should be grabbing hold of contradictions as a burning branding iron as much as a productive institution, and that we should actually, when we groove, we should also be angry?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
If you could answer these questions in a way that wraps up nicely the book.
And bring in AI?
Yeah, and also this AI question.
Yeah.
Great questions.
Briefly, Sylvia, I mean, the obvious idiocy and monstrousness of that. I mean, it seems to me that, the vulnerability of the BBC at the moment is the bigger picture behind that little stunt. And it's very difficult because there's so many things wrong with the BBC, particularly in its news coverage of certain areas, that, ultimately, as I was implying earlier, I think it still needs defending. Joanna, what an important thing you raise. I feel that's such an important issue, is that geographical inequality in access to a diversity of culture. And coming from East Lancashire as we do, I think we have a sense of how difficult it is to access diversity of culture, real diversity in certain places. And I think it's more than just London. I think it's probably cities, isn't it? It's you can feel the difference between Manchester and the satellite towns around it. And my amazing sister is doing incredible work in trying to revivify the Coliseum Theatre in Oldham as part of that kind of struggle. And so much more I could say about that, but maybe I can potentially glibly link it to Jason. That's the kind of thing that makes me furious, that the erosion, in large part due to the most appalling austerity politics of the resources that enable culture to be lived at a local level. To do that simultaneously with the triumph of IT in the form of the platforms over the last 15 years, has led to. I don't want to overstate it, and I don't think it's true that there are absolute cultural deserts. I think people are still making culture in their own way, aren't they? Even in places far from the financial and cultural centres. But that infuriates me. And yeah, I think part of it, Jason Toynbee at the back, has been also absolutely crucial. As important as Georgie, who I mentioned earlier, to my intellectual formation, his book, Making Popular Music, published in 2000, was absolutely crystallised for me a whole set of ideas about the kind of contradiction and complexity that I'm talking about. But Jason's one of those amazing people who's got angrier and more and more activist as he's got older, and I want to take that lesson. I think it's just that I'm very conscious of my responsibility as a teacher as well, and so like my writing is often coming from a pedagogical place, and it feels like my political anger needs to be expressed elsewhere alongside that, and I do want to find more spaces in which to do that as I'm now free of the burden of this. Maybe we should leave it.
Yeah, on that note,
can I just say before that there's some copies on sale and I'll sign them. 33%.
So complex, Dave. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. Thank you, Dave.